Did you know that a single act of defiance can topple centuries of tradition and usher in new dynasties? Today we will dive into a period when Rome was fractured by internal disputes and, ironically, grew stronger to create one of the greatest empires in history. It was the day the Republic collapsed to make way for something even grander yet equally tumultuous. Get ready, as these battles and intrigues will reveal how the end of one era can mark the beginning of another, without anyone being able to predict the final outcome. The first triumvirate united three powerful forces: Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They formed an alliance to overcome the resistance of the Senate, which feared their rapid rise. Crassus sought military glory, while Caesar gained prestige through his victories in Gaul, and Pompey expanded his influence in Rome. But could this union sustain the Republic, or would it sow the ruin of its very foundations? Crassus's death at the Battle of Carrhae opened a political vacuum, leaving Caesar and Pompey face to face. With the disappearance of the third pillar, the rivalry between the two inevitably intensified. Did you know that this tension arose not just from personal ambition, but from the fear of losing control of a loyal army? After all, whoever commanded the legions would be the master of Rome, and consequently, its future destinies. As Caesar expanded his conquests, Pompey drew closer to the Senate, seeking to legitimize himself as a defender of the Republic. In contrast, the Senate viewed Pompey as the last barrier against Caesar's rising power. However, the fragile balance relied on the obedience of charismatic generals who preferred to carve their own paths. It is no surprise that the fuse was close, generating the spark of an inevitable civil war. It was when Caesar received the order to abandon his army that everything changed. He crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, declaring war on the Senate and Pompey, in a bold and irreversible move. This act demonstrated that military strength trumped political authority, marking history with blood and ambition. And if this show of power paved the way for a new form of government, what impact would it have on the course of Rome? With the crossing of the Rubicon, Caesar seized Italy, advancing towards Rome with little opposition. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, where they hoped to unite the loyal legions for a counterattack. Caesar's lightning-fast advance caught everyone off guard, showcasing the power of his army. But to what extent would this initial momentum guarantee a definitive victory? The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC sealed Pompey's fate, who fled to Egypt seeking refuge. There, he was assassinated, an episode that shocked even Caesar, who wanted to capture him alive. Did you know that this event illustrates the brutality of foreign politics, where alliances shifted with convenience? Still, Egypt would become the stage for a historic intervention by Caesar. In Egypt, Caesar supported Cleopatra against Ptolemy III, consolidating an alliance that would mark an era. Drawn by wealth and strategic position, he recognized the value of controlling the Nile Delta. At the same time, his political maneuvers demonstrated that Rome's expansion hinged on dominating key provinces. But would this merely be the beginning of a lasting relationship between Rome and Egypt? After consolidating the East, Caesar turned his attention to the last strongholds of Republican resistance in Africa and Hispania. His victories seemed to solidify an uncontested power, but the calm would not last long. The quest for absolute power did not go unnoticed, and many feared that the Republic was being buried. Who could have predicted that these conquests were just the prelude to an even more surprising fate? With total victory, Caesar proclaimed himself dictator for life, amassing unprecedented honors. He implemented bold reforms, distributing land, and seeking to integrate the provinces into central power. Did you know that many saw this as the seed of a disguised monarchy, threatening the pillars of the Republic? After all, who would willingly accept losing the freedoms that had upheld a century-old political order? Caesar's popularity with the people contrasted sharply with the fear of the senatorial aristocracy. The Senate, once a central power hub, felt increasingly ornate and irrelevant. Brutus and Cassius, fearing a king in Rome, led the conspiracy that culminated in Caesar's assassination. But could the death of a single man halt the transformations already underway? On the fateful Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed in the Senate, an act that echoed throughout Rome. It was believed that the dictator's sacrifice would bring back the Republican era, but the reality was different. Did you know that instead of restoring stability, the assassination sparked a new civil war? It was just the beginning of a fierce struggle for the legacy left by Caesar. With Caesar's fall, the Republic let out a brief sigh of relief, but soon it was engulfed in chaos. Caesar's image split Rome, which came to both venerate and fear him equally. His greatest impact, paradoxically, was to accelerate the formation of an even more centralized regime under his political and military heirs. How would these successors steer Rome into a new era of imperial power? Shortly after Caesar's death, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate to hunt down his assassins. Driven by the desire for revenge, they divided power and influence over Rome. Did you know that this new alliance returned to the formula of concentrating military and political strength in the hands of a few? Yet the conflicting interests among them would soon come to the surface. In the Battle of Philippi, 42 BC, the conspirators Brutus and Cassius were defeated, burying the Republican dream. However, the victory also exposed the internal tensions within the triumvirate. Octavian controlled the west, Antony dominated the east, and Lepidus was losing ground. With growing distrust, a new confrontation loomed on the horizon. Mark Antony's closeness with Cleopatra heightened tensions, as Octavian feared the formation of a powerful bloc in the east. Meanwhile, Octavian strengthened his propaganda, painting Antony as a traitor to Rome. The Roman people, loyal to Caesar's memory, leaned toward supporting his official heir. But what would be the consequences of a conflict between these two giants? In the decisive Battle of Actium, 31 BC, Octavian emerged victorious, forcing Antony and Cleopatra to flee. With the defeat, a path opened for Octavian's absolute dominion, who would soon be acclaimed Augustus. The already shaken republic found itself replaced by a centralized empire. But to what extent would this change ensure peace, or set the stage for future disputes? Since the civil wars, it became clear that the army was key to power, overriding traditional politics. Whoever controlled the legions could proclaim themselves leader of Rome, as Caesar demonstrated by crossing the Rubicon. Did you know that? Even in the empire, this logic led to conflicts such as the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD. Ambitious generals saw military might as a direct path to the throne, undermining imperial unity. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 AD, took this scenario to the extreme, with dozens of emperors succeeding one another at a frantic pace. The legions elected and deposed rulers, turning Roman politics into a hostage of military whims. This instability eroded structures, necessitating reforms and generating distrust between senators and generals. But what would happen when external forces also pressured the borders of a troubled empire? The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD was partly a consequence of this military fragmentation. Lacking cohesion, the legions could not fend off barbarian invasions, and each region sought to defend its own interests. Curiously, the root of this phenomenon lay back in the civil wars, which demonstrated the strength of a general over state authority. Can an empire endure without internal unity and consolidated obedience? The story of Rome makes it clear that military power, if not balanced by strong institutions, can dismantle a state from within. Even though the legions upheld imperial power, the peaceful succession became a constant challenge. If the army elected the emperor, another general could depose him in the next campaign. How can cohesion be maintained when the throne rises on the tip of swords? The conquest of Egypt was one of the direct legacies of the civil wars, initiated by Caesar's intervention. Rich in grain and other goods, Egypt became Rome's true granary. Did you know that any revolt in Alexandria immediately affected the food supply in the capital? It is not surprising that the emperor personally managed the province without relying on the Senate. With Cleopatra's death, Octavian annexed Egypt as an imperial province, shielding it from external interference. This prevented rival generals from obtaining resources to challenge centralized power. For the new sovereign, controlling the Nile was more than a military conquest. It was the guarantee of continuous legitimization. Would this centralization be enough to prevent rebellions and keep Rome always supplied? Over the centuries, Rome's prosperity was tied to controlling the grain and wealth routes. Any turmoil in the Nile region reverberated through the halls of the Palatine, where imperial decisions were made. This vital link between economy and politics reinforced the emperor's power, but also made him hostage to potential crises. It is no surprise that Egypt was treated as an invaluable jewel of the empire. The history of Egypt in the Roman orbit reveals that dominating a territory goes beyond victory on the battlefield. It is necessary to manage and protect it, ensuring the supplies and stability that sustain the capital itself. If Rome relied on Egyptian wheat, the emperor drew nourishment from the loyalty gained through these provisions. But wouldn't this dependence weaken in the long run the foundations of such a vast empire? The civil wars made it clear that the Senate, once sovereign, could no longer contain the personal ambitions of military leaders. Caesar, and after him, Octavian, consolidated powers that exceeded senatorial reach. Did you know that, even with the institution intact, the Senate became merely a symbol, sanctioning decisions that were not its own? True command shifted to the figure of the emperor. This erosion of senatorial power began when Caesar assumed successive prerogatives, undermining the ancient privileges of aristocratic Rome. The senators, lacking military strength, became hostages to the decisions of the dictator and his successors. For the elite, the only option left was to adapt to the demands of the new regime or risk their own lives. But how could one cope with the loss of a power that had dictated laws for centuries? Throughout the empire, the Senate became a stage for intrigues and appearances, never regaining its original authority. Emperors consulted the Senate, but only to legitimize already decided measures. The center of deliberation shifted to the court, to the barracks, and to the singular will of the emperor. Would it be plausible to imagine a return to the old republic in the face of the overwhelming rise of the imperial figure? The civil wars demolished the belief that collective will would be superior to the charisma and army of a single man. From then on, Rome was governed as an empire, where the Senate was a formality and tradition but not a real power. This turnaround brought momentary stability, but paved the way for succession crises that would shake the foundations of the state. After all, every vertical power structure depends on the solidity of its occupant. The civil wars of the 1st century BC not only toppled the republic, but paved the way for one of the greatest empires of antiquity. The strength of the legions, the wealth of provinces like Egypt, and the centralization of power in the emperor forever changed Roman history. Every battle, every conspiracy, and every fragile alliance contributed to the formation of a regime that would dominate much of the known world. However, it is undeniable that the same flames that forged this empire would also ignite internal crises that would lead to its final downfall. It is fascinating to think how an act of defiance, such as crossing the Rubicon, could trigger centuries of political transformations. Rome proved strong enough to rebuild amid chaos, but also vulnerable to tyrannical leadership. Have you ever wondered if Caesar's death would have prevented monarchy, or whether everything was already destined for Rome? These reflections remind us that history is woven from circumstances and ambitions that intertwine. When we contemplate the ruins of Rome, we see echoes of past glories and lessons relevant to the present. Power, whether military or economic, demands responsibility, for it can strengthen empires or destroy them from within. If Caesar had survived, would Rome have found greater stability or merely postponed inevitable conflicts? Every act carries a consequence, and the eternal city was shaped by risky choices and their ramifications. Now it's your turn to engage with this legacy. Share in the comments what you think would have happened if Caesar had ruled for a longer time. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue exploring epic historical narratives. Send this video to friends and family who love learning about the great stories of power and conquest. Your like reinforces our commitment to bringing more intriguing stories that connect yesterday to our world today.